lot of work in a lifetime. Came to the conclusion about 5 years ago, no, 6 or 7 years ago, that whatever I'd done, and by inference, whatever anybody else had done, was insufficient if we're going to look at something like a sixth extinction, if we're going to look at a heat wave. Whoops. Whoa. So I thought I'd show you the best work we ever did and explain why it's not good enough. And then what I think we ought to be doing, or some of us ought to be doing, and why, finally, it turns out that the glaciers are our best teacher. We got telephone calls from Holland. We asked, what's the matter? Why do you keep calling us? They said, well, we have a place where we have the Green Heart. And it's about 800 square kilometers. And around it are the Randstad, the great cities, the Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Den Haag, et al., Utrecht. And there's about 6 million people there. And they got 13 villages in there, in the 800 square kilometers. And the 800 square kilometers, they look like this, is the whole history of Holland. Windmills, all that stuff you know. But stuff you don't know. And the stuff you don't know is it formed the first or the basis for democracy itself, as the process of pumping required the formation of a simple democratic association. And so I got told that the planning group thought that 600,000 houses had to be built there. And that was about $230 billion economic engine. And it was the only place to do it. And sadly, that development would extract the whole history of place. You know, everybody talks about extraction, but we forget about extracting cultures and language, and this would sure do it. And so the planning group called us up and asked if we could come over and maybe do something. So I met with people in Parliament. And they said, they had given us 10 books. Each book was a plan to solve the Green Heart problem. Each book was a local expert. Each book flopped. Each book was 3 or 4 months' work. Each book cost a couple $100,000, maybe more. So if you add it all up, it was a mess. So we said, we'll solve your Green Heart problem. I was exaggerating. So the congressman said, well, what makes you think you can do it? And we said, well, you can't. Look, these 10 books, you wasted $1.5 million on it so far, and we're much cheaper than that. In fact, we're a cheap date. So we shook hands and made a verbal contract and agreed to save the Green Heart of Holland. Part of our contracts are not normal contracts because we told them that the Green Heart itself was our client, not them, and that's who we were going to take direction from, not them. And if they didn't like it, we'd go home. And they liked it all right, so we didn't go home. So we made them an installation. The installation had a floor. And the floor was in Delft tile, the whole landscape of Holland. And everybody could see their house, and everybody could see their proposal on it. And grandmas brought their kids around. It's a way of democratizing information when you leave work at that scale. It's about 24 feet across. Also, this work was in something called the Jerusalem Chapel. That meant we were privileged. Jesus was looking down on us. Truly odd experience. So, the first thing we did was made a map of Holland backward. And we drew in 300,000 houses. That's the dark drawing. And the planners got miffed at us. And they said, newspapers and all, that's 8 foot square. And why'd you do that? Well, you're planning your country backwards. You're thinking backwards. You didn't even look at your whole landscape. And you're about to drop your history into history. For what? And also all the money that you put in there will go to international developers. So next thing that happened was they said, well, if that's wrong, what's right? I said, what's right is build a biodiversity ring around the center. If you build a biodiversity ring, it'll fill up with water, find its own ecosystem, become a water purification system, purify about 60 million cubic meters a year, and pay for your whole operation at, of course, about $1 a cubic meter for good water. So over term, you know, if you do a bond issue. And they said, what the green wiggles for? They call them the wiggles. And the green wiggles that you see going out is our critique of planning in general. What they are narrow parks between all the cities, Delft, Amsterdam, Haarlem, et al. And what that does is as follows. Each one of those parks ends up in an ecologically interesting area so that biodiversity can travel back and forth, but much more important, it keeps the cities from bleeding into one another. Each city is a historic entity. Each city was once a city-state. Each city was going to lose its identity along with all the little cities in the center. All for what? And so the Dutch are pretty good to work with, I must say. I actually advise working there because they say what they will do and then they do it. But God forbid you don't. One time, for instance, our text was due on a Friday, and our project manager, a 23-year-old sociology student, said, why isn't it ready? I said, be ready on Monday. You said Friday. So we were never late again. So it's kind of fun to work for. So finally, we go into, well, where are you going to put 600,000 houses? We said, are you certain you need 600,000 houses? They said, where are you going to put 600,000 houses with infrastructure and schools and fire departments? And we'll spend the $230 billion to do it, but where are you going to put it? Well, we had a team. When we go someplace, we ask for a team. Because you can't do our kind of work without a bunch of smart locals working with you, people who grew up there and who love the place, and you get to like it. They sent me to Green's Heart School for about 2 months, driving all around, so there was no part of this place I didn't see. Well, now, one of our team was a really smart landscape architect lady. She was just ready to graduate. And so I pulled her aside and said, look, you have an unlimited budget. Go out and find me where you can put 600,000 houses outside of the Green Heart, but inside of the city, the surround cities. So about $1,500 later, about that amount of time later, about a month later, she shows up with this drawing. She proves that 600,000 houses can be put as infill around the cities without violating the architectural properties, without them bleeding into one another, and without losing their history. So, this wins the day. What does winning the day mean? The environmental industry takes it, the environmental ministry takes it on. The big Amsterdam, I guess it would be called the Financial Times, reviews it. $230 billion is now going to be spun back into the country. Local architecture will be honored. Local work would be there. And maybe you don't need 600,000 houses. but we also found space to put 700,000 houses. So that's how we work. There's redundancy in systems. And what they hadn't done was what we did, hold it. That's the Green Heart without it. And that's an engineering drawing, which shows each field. Each field is below sea level. Each field has dikes or has a little lake, a little stream around it you pump water out of, so that an engineering company could build our work from this drawing. We're not engineers, but we know enough to do such a thing. And so what this, we call it the icon. What this icon showed us was that the planners weren't looking at their own terrain. They were looking at their prejudices. They were looking at the long-held belief there's not enough room in our country to build. And the answer was, sure there is. And to everybody's advantage. So, well, we're there about a week, and we're getting, after this is up, and getting all kinds of praise. And an election happens. The right wing moves in. The Minister of the Environment changes. Our work is put on the back shelf. It's suggested we should go home quickly, which we did do. Oh, one last thing. If you look at this, you would find, see all the little dots, they're houses. You would find if you follow this plan, you have 160 running kilometers of parkland to build against. And who comes late to these buildings? The immigrants, the poorer people. And so all of a sudden parklands were available when they never would have been available before. And the kind of compressed slum type stuff can't happen by virtue of the way the design takes place. And this is what's saved, by the way. It's stunning. It's their Central Park. It's their farm. It's their history. To be in it is a joyous thing. Well, at any rate, we're kicked out. And then 5 years later, the Ministry of Environment calls us back, says the bad guys are voted out, you're voted in, we're doing your plan. But we're not going to do your wiggles. We're going to make parks, but the biodiversity ring itself, we can do better than you, which is we can run biodiversity up and down the rivers and the river edges, and therefore our solution's in advance of yours. And that's why we do what we call open-ended design. The open-ended thing is the principle is at work. We don't insist that you follow our design. We do insist that you follow the principle. And if you can outthink us, terrific. After all, we're a small group. Time passes, new information comes in. And so the three principles we laid on the table were biodiversity needs to be continuous, cultural diversity needs to be framed, and the whole system has to be seen as yin-yang. If you plan one part of it, then you got to look at its relationship to, and what it does to every other part. And once you do that, you'll be okay. And as far as we can tell, they are. Now, about 5 years after that, after all this is done 25 years ago, about 5 years after that, this appears. The Green Heart suddenly shows up as one of the 7 most valuable places in Northwest Europe and should be saved at all costs according to the EU. Who knew? This is what we call unintended circumstances. We find that when we design like this and we work like this and we create an alternate urban narrative, and the thing operates in art time and art scale as well as urban time and urban scale, the narrative happens and embeds itself into the culture, and it goes to work for you, and it changes your work. And it didn't change our work for worse, it changed it for better. Now, this is a drawing from the Green Heart Studio in 1994. They snitched it. It's almost an exact copy. The best part of working, when you work at the scale we do, is your idea stays, but this doesn't say Harrison Studio. Thus, you fade into anonymity. The larger your work, the more anonymous you need to accept becoming. It's enough for us to be in the history books, which we are. So, why do I say it's insufficient? It's a hell of a work. It's as follows. Can somebody tell me how the time is? Will you tell, if I'm talking to one, how long have I got about 20 minutes? Okay. I tend to ramble. Why would I dismiss this work and 40 years' work before it? I don't dismiss it, it's pretty good. But you see, a sixth extinction is upon us. This becomes clear to us somewhere around 8, 9 years ago. And systems breakdown is upon us. That is to say, think about how the life web works. The life web works by niches, and each niche is a give and take system. If you take more from such a system than you give, in due course, it has less energy. After that, if you take too much, you have systems collapse. It doesn't have enough energy to keep up, to keep itself. So that's what we're doing. All of our systems are extracted from, but we have not invented our design to a point. And this is my argument with the last designer, Dawn. We haven't pushed our design to a point where the act of taking is the act of giving. All living things do this. The amoeba does it, takes in, the amoeba has intelligence. How do we know it has intelligence? It's living. What does that mean? It means that it takes stuff into itself, processes it, and gives it out. That's called a dissipative structure. Things dissipate. Stop dissipating, you stop living. So we came to the conclusion we better start doing work that gives back as much as it takes, or start to find ways to do that, or to mediate at great scale. We invented a new way of working. The university built us a little nonprofit, and it's called, and our way of working is called the Force Majeure. And the Force Majeure describes the forces unleashed by the continuing rise in the average temperatures of Earth's climate systems, generated by vast industrial processes of resource extraction and carbon dioxide production. Nowhere do we give back. And the technology that says we can fix it part by part is absurd. Are we going to, for instance, invent something that will pull CO2 out of the air so we can continue? Then we're going to invent something that's going to pull acidity out of the ocean so that it can take CO2 in and that the ecosystem in the thermocline doesn't collapse? Are we going to feed back into the great forests we've removed so that they can continue to process topsoil, create weather, hold stuff in the ground, hold water in the ground? Are we going to do that? No, we don't. What happens is our design processes now, thank you, Bucky Fuller, are making much more efficient the way we proceed with things. But the way we proceed with things does not give back as much as it takes. The way we proceed with things now has the benefit of taking less and less, more and more efficiently. And that's inefficient. We begin with, let's see, the Center for the Force Majeure is it's like an oncoming storm front. It's a fluid frontier, a frontier of exponentially increasing heat moving across a planet, and a warming of water advancing on all lands, and a frontier of extinctions touching all lives. So the question we ask in our research is, are there counterforces available? Well, I don't know. We do three kinds of work. One at large scale, one at intimate scale, and one on governance. That is, can we invent governance forms that themselves become niches in the life web itself, where the form of governance gives back into the web as much as it takes, although a different form, since it will have been processed. Okay. Our first form of planning, design, in sense that, you know, like I'm feeling uncomfortable saying design all the time. In truth, we're artists, okay? So our first way of making art, we begin with a guiding metaphor. It says, only fools pick a fight with the oceans, the forests, the topsoil, the atmosphere itself. Wise folk dance with the indeterminacy that is upon them. Now, what does that all mean? Well, it's our counter-argument to sustainability. Sustainability suggests that you can stop something and keep it like it is. With every molecule in movement and change continuing, that's virtually impossible. It's a developer's way of getting away with stuff, in my opinion. What we really need to be thinking about, as I was talking to David McConville before, is dropping the idea of sustainability and switching to a notion of continuing. How do we continue? Well, we continue by becoming part of the life web itself. Well, I'll show you a couple of works. How's my time? Okay. We did this with the European Union, the German government, and 5 museums, one in Holland, one in France, and one in Germany. Its basic cost was around $600,000, but this is the 5th version of it. The first version filled up a museum of about 3,000 square feet. Okay. In this case, we note, see the arrows? They say that Europe, a drought is moving from Portugal, and Turkey even, up to the center and will stop pretty close to Germany, to mid-Europe. Now, what can we understand? Presently, get this thing here. Presently, the browns represent 2.3 million square kilometers of farmland, mostly monoculture. There's so many rivers there because we privileged them over the roads. Therefore, the map's dishonest, but fun. The greens are mostly high ground forest, mostly monoculture, and the yellows are about 340 square kilometers of pasture lands, also over-fertilized with nitrogen. Therefore, ecologically simplified. So, see if I get it right. So, incidentally, we made an earlier map which showed that if the waters rose a few meters, they'd lose about 10,000, 15,000 square miles and about 20 million people would have to move up. But so 50 years from now, Europe's looking at something like this. They're going to lose about a third of their ability to produce food, and they're going to lose about 5–10% of the land, 50, 75 years. And what is anybody doing about this? Well, they're funding extra fishing fleets to make more money fishing. They're funding more clever ways of farming to draw more off the land. But they're really fighting for more jobs. We spent a lot of time in Brussels, met some of the high-level folk, and they said democracy doesn't work. Anybody can stop you from doing anything. So, democracy doesn't work. What will work? Well, I think this might work. Right there, is something that existed in Portugal, a dry landscape in Portugal about 30 years ago. Some people went there and made a water retention landscape. Now, what's a water retention landscape? Go back to the peninsula, and you ask, what do all these farmers do over 1,000 years? They flattened the land. They tipped it slightly so waters would go off slowly. They'd soak in, but they wouldn't stay long enough for roots to rot. Well, with no water to run off, and no water, therefore no place to collect the water, what to do? So, our proposal is as follows. First of all, we calculated it out to be a $1 trillion proposal, roughly the cost of a Bush war, which is the kind of monies we're going to have to start spending to create the counter forces necessary. Well, what we require is inspired hydrologists and geographers to redesign the land so that first to locate all the aquifers, which we have, then to retip the land so that when it rains heavily, which it will, those waters run to the low spots for aquifer recharge. At which point then, that land would turn not into a uniform farm, it would turn into what amounted to be a multitude of oases. Now, what would that mean? That would mean that farming would have to change, because when it rained a lot, you could farm a lot. When it rained a little, you farmed less. Each of these oases, or low parts, have a wetland, have species surviving in them, have biodiversity, and the like. And at the same time, a new kind of community has to form, a much more collaborative, cooperative community to run these things, and to be inventive with them. So, with that in mind, then one would maybe return 2/3 of the amount of food that you once had from that kind of farming, from industrial farming. But you would probably produce enough to reduce or make unlikely civil collapse. Because I think you're looking at revolution and civil collapse, where the rich do well, the upper middle class do sort of okay, the lower class and poor people do terribly, and you have a disrupted social order. So I think this calls for reinventing, to a degree, certain kinds of social order and letting the ecology be your teacher. So that would be Peninsula Europe. A tough call, I must say. Sent it off to the EU and they said we're too busy. But one of our works, Angela Merkel, opened in Germany. It's Endangered Meadows. And so if we get funded appropriately, and we're starting to meet funding people now, then I think we can get to Merkel and get this opened up and put together the team that starts making it. Because this needs to be put in place over the next 25 years. So that would be a large-scale force majeure work. An exhibition was planned, and we were asked what we would do for the bays of San Francisco. And so we proposed that it was more interesting to see what a bays of San Francisco would do to us if it rose about 3 meters. If it rises about 3 meters, here's one of the nice ideas. If you want to save yourself from flood there, you have to build a 160-mile-long dike for X billions of dollars. I guess it's $1 billion a mile, maybe more. And you better hope that the sea only raises 3 or 4 meters. because you'll get overtopped by the high winds and tides. So what are the San Francisco folk doing? They run into Holland to find good dike makers. So what are we doing? Well, okay. Here's what it looks like with a 1 meter rise. There's what it looks like with a 2 meter rise. There's what it looks like with a 3 meter rise. That's what it looks like with a 5 meter rise, 5, 6 meters. So, how do you make a virtue out of such a thing? Well, the Central Valley of California has been abused by the Army Corps of Engineers and our Congress and everybody else, as everybody knows, for the last 75 years when they kicked the Japanese truck farmers out who knew how to farm and knew how to live in that context. It was a terrible thing to do. And then, all of a sudden, you couldn't farm unless you had less than a couple thousand acres. And all of a sudden, because all the rivers were dammed, water cost $25 a million gallons. 2 million gallons is what you needed to grow rice in the desert. That's 6 acre feet. An acre foot is 326,000 gallons. 3 acre feet is roughly a million. So what we did was we wrecked our rivers. We cut down all the trees on top that would have made for the safety of the rivers. Then we made our rivers into sort of spigots and water and water tubes, and we sent and fertilized this whole land. Now it's not working so well. Drought screwed us up. Just rained enough to hold that back for a few years, but it'll come back. So, what's so interesting about an estuarial lagoon? Well, so happens we studied them. And if you look at a highly productive estuarial lagoon with a temperature raise of 6 or 7 degrees now, so it's warm water, and with fresh water flowing in from all those rivers off the Sierra Nevada, and some of those dams pulled away because they're stuffed full of sand and don't work so well anymore. Well, an estuarial lagoon, if properly managed, is the most fertile production of any place on the planet. This would produce approximately 1,000 pounds of food wet weight a year in a low-intensity aquaculture system, which maintained its biodiversity, but you would harvest different crops every year because you would encourage the growth by breathing the wastes, the purified wastes of the city of San Francisco into this, which would push the production a little bit high, and you harvest the overproduction. Thus, the harvest preserves the system. The harvest does not destroy the system, then you start all over again. And there's a different kind of farming. So the farmer becomes the preserver, as well as the harvester, the conserver, really. And so it's these kinds of things that design has to lead us into. In fact, art and storytelling lead us here, and metaphor leads us here. And these kind of narratives have to build themselves back into the culture so that it looks normal. Right now, irrigated farming looks normal to people. It doesn't look normal to me. Look crazy. But there you have it. Pretty neat looking. I was totally surprised when our map makers came up with this. So, well, we got hooked. We did a piece. How much was my time? How much? Oh, okay. We did a piece. And the Berkeley Research Station, 9,000 acres sage hen, up near Lake Tahoe, about 10 miles off, on 89. And what we did was this. We said, if it's going to get 7 degrees hotter up here, what's going to live? And so we did what we call a future garden. We did a big search, found the 20 most resilient species there, based on the idea that any place that's already lived through a heat wave and been 7 degrees warmer in its history has the genetic resources to do it again if you help it along. We selected 20 species. We grew them. And after 3 years, I'll show you the piece later. After 3 years, 25% lived. So it showed we were right. Meanwhile, we got fire in the West. And the forests burning because of bad harvesting and bad lumber work, and you all know the story, and Jerry Brown's in a snit about it, and he's correct to be so. So our group, whoops, not going. Oh, look at that. That must be too heavy. So this is the story that the bad harvesting generated great loss and generated this kind of tree structure, tall, thin overproduction of trees. That situation set up the conditions for a crown fire. You all know about crown fires. Oops, what's happening? So, in Seychellen, 2,000 acres were cleared so that there are only 60 or 70 trees per acre. If that's done, that harvesting, the wood becomes useful one way, but that kind of harvesting leaves only 60 or 70 trees per acre and sets up the conditions for only ground fires. Doesn't cost much, but California would have to spend $15 billion to clear off 15 million acres this way in order to save itself $30 billion and its forests, because that costs $1.5 billion a year to save them from fire. So that's what it looks like when it's cleared. What is this? This is amazing. That's what comes back. Biodiverse, healthy, and then you have controlled burning like the early folk did, like the indigenous folk did and still do. And that means that lots of seeds can germinate, and you don't have a crown fire. And that fire brings new sprouts, which brings new species back in, and so on. So that's what Saving the West is about, except you harvest twice. Once the good wood is called saw logs, and twice this kind of wood, which turns into board. And I don't know what to do with this damn thing here. It turns into this. Which, and now you got the corker, if I can get it. Turns into this. Look at the statistics. A cubic meter of wood in a building effectively sequesters a ton of CO2. A 20-story wood building would sequester 3,100 tons of carbon, or hold it, store it, and save 1,200 tons of the CO2 from emitted by the construction of concrete. So this building here pulls 4,300 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. So we proposed to Jerry Brown that what we really need to save our forests, because if you harvest them the way you harvest the lagoons and so on, the act of harvesting preserves the system. The act of harvesting in 100,000 acre groupings makes for new kinds of communities, and at the same time, science, and at the same time, if you did this for the cities if government buildings and then cities, you would be saving gigatons of carbon. What does this mean? Well, a gigaton of carbon drops the carbon count 1 point. So we're at 410 now, about parts per million. Well, if you drop 10 gigatons, you drop it to 400 parts per million from 410. So we have to think about that way. But at the same time, we would have a profitable industry of, but even more important, sequestering carbon this way and preserving the forest that way enhances biodiversity. If we are doing systems that enhance and save and help biodiversity become more so, we are reducing the power of the extinction curve. So that's what we mean by a virtuous operation. So a grand synthesis needs to be designed, put on the ground. Many parts are in place. Industry, knowledge, science, with the exception of a viable market, yet all are separate, each happening in a different place. We propose a new category entitled Whole System Site, where a grand synthesis can occur. A guiding metaphor appears. Assisting adaptation is collaboration with nature. Well, we're working with stuff on the ground as well. There's a lot of despair. The problem's so big, what are you going to do? Well, this is called the Future Garden. Invented it first in '95 at the Kunstausstellungshalle in Bonn when we were doing a work called the Endangered Meadows. What it does, what it suggests, it poses a question. What's Bonn going to look like if it drops, if the temperature rises 3 degrees centigrade? Well, it turns out that some paleobotanical research was done for us, and the dawn redwood was there about 3 million years ago. So, maybe 3.5. And so, here's what we did. We invented this garden and said, well, the constant will be a raise in temperature. The inconstant will be how much water you're going to have. If the temperature rises, there's going to be more water in the air, therefore more likely for rain, but more likely for drought as well. So let's plan both warmer and drier. And this work lets something out. You know, it shows you that first, we planted it, and we made the planting such that human beings could eat the stuff, but so could other animals, much like the Native Americans did here. Then we put warning signals. You know, each one of those little greenhouses is where our proposal doesn't work, like the ozone comes too heavy, like the disturbance from insects wrecks the environment, like the virus comes. And then we do our humorous piece. We got a piece from the ice core, and we set a Buddha statue on it and put a blanket around it and called it the Shivering Buddha. Because, you see, there's some chance we're going to hit an ice age. The chance is low, but it exists, actually very low. So that's what a future garden would be like, but we didn't know it on the ground. In the Sage Hen, which I just showed you, the forest there, we got, I guess, $250,000 grant from Annenberg, and we chose 5 sites at 5 altitudes. We grew 12,000 plants that were selected for not their fragileness, we've got to save them, but for their hardiness, you can't kill them. We planted at different altitudes. And this is Brett Hall, our botanist. He does a species count there. And that's when we discover that on all altitudes, 25% live. And we find that where the sun is brightest, more live, and where they're shaded by trees, less live. So we didn't know that. And other things showed up as well. But what that says is, here's the Native American team that helped us. That's Stephen, the wise man. He's trying to save the culture there. And then another one comes up for the We get 3 domes at the Arboretum where we will grow the species again at 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer with 3 variations in water. And what's the idea here? The idea here is that local groups with local botanical knowledge can make a future garden for their place, can create the scaffolding for a future plant-based ecosystem as die-out happens, instead of waiting for the, I guess you would call the migration of species, which are very hard to do by virtue of their being out of, they're too few, and there's too much blockage, and there's too much infrastructure. And so as species die out, it's possible to create a return that's faster. It speeds it up. The person before me, Dawn, who was talking about speeding up design, has the same, is the same notion, and she's right. So that's what it looks like on the ground. We've gotten enough money to rehab the domes, and we're doing our species searches right now. I'll do this quickly. We also have a site on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau that poses the question, what will grow in 400,000 acres of the Sichuan province? We land at that airport. We head down the Mim River to your left. We come to Site 1. That's really Site 2, but we choose it. That's the landscape. That's where we'll do our planting. Our botanists will be selecting species from the Mims River, which runs right by it, almost within the next 2 months, which, if they drop about 4,000 feet, it's about 6 or 7 degrees warmer there, and alternately drier and wetter, and therefore they'll start to grow the future of that whole valley in this site, and we'll see how it works. That's us. I'm 84 years old, so insurance was taken on me to make sure a hospital plane could fly me back because I was 13,000 feet up, but it turned out to be fine. Tangya is on the right. It's a stunning landscape. The Tibetan family gets what we're doing, has bought into the whole thing, and they'll guard it. The last thing that we do, and I'll stay on it very briefly, is governance. We're done unless governance changes. Okay. What do we mean by changing governance? Well, you have to go back to how the life web works. It's 3.5 billion years old. It's learned a lot. The first thing it's learned, the thing that it's learned most about, is that it's self-forming, self-organizing, self-knowing, and you can imagine it has a voice of its own. So as artists, we imagine it say it's 3.5 billion years old, and it's saying to the human race, which is only 3.5 million years, 1/10 of 1% of its existence, you're about to end my life as I know it. And what we're doing is getting the 3.5 billion year entity to start to advise us. Some of the things that we're coming up with is first working at the scale you saw in Peninsula Europe or Tibet. But second is to start finding a way that everything we do, everything we take gives back not in equal measure, but in equal energy level measure. And so that's hard to do. But if we don't do it, then any system we take things from, we weaken. And we do so knowingly. And we are responsible. And so the most recent effort that we're making is putting together a new governance roundtable. We just got it funded to begin to think our way into what we would call life web governance. Thank you.